Hop. Bien, bonsoir. Good afternoon. You must be tired. No. Thank you. So, the title of the session is How to Break the Violent Extremism and Populism, Authoritarianism Cycle. We have 4 panelists. We have Ambassador Rami Mortada, Rosa Balfour, François Burgat, and Henri Barquet. I'll present them later, but I shall give immediately the floor to Ambassador Mortada. Ambassador Mortada is Lebanese ambassador to Belgium and the European Union since 2013. He is senior official for Lebanon in the Union for the Mediterranean. He served in the diplomatic foreign service for 23 years. He's still very young. And in his capacity, he has been involved since the very beginning in the Barcelona process. He worked in the United States, in Europe, and his background is political science and law. Son propos va porter sur la situation géopolitique, surtout dans la région du Moyen-Orient, le rapport de la géopolitique à la radicalisation, et il va nous présenter quelques réflexions, quelques pistes de réflexion pour sortir de cette impasse. Alors, cher ambassadeur, la parole est à vous.
Thank you, Chair. I see on this panel that I'm the only government official, so I hope I will not have to answer for the authoritarian part of the... But on a more serious sense, I'm glad to be here in this beautiful city of Barcelona, and thank you for inviting me, IEMed and EuroMeSCo, to this important event, and glad to share the podium with such important scholars and experts, which I will try to match, but I don't promise. Well, let me start by saying that coming to Barcelona, for me personally, and I think for many persons in this room, it brings nostalgic memories for those who are involved with this EuroMed, the so-called Barcelona process. I personally attended the Barcelona summit first one back in 95 and the second one in 2005. And since then, we were all embarked in this dream of having this area of peace and prosperity in the Mediterranean, the region that we share. But obviously, something went wrong. The proof is the current situation in both regions. I will probably focus more today on the so-called southern neighborhood of the European Union at large. Your neighbors and the neighbors of your neighbors, which are all in what we call the MENA region. I think today more than ever, academia is called to reflect and to propose solutions, because obviously governments are in disarray, are in confusion. One of the collateral outcomes or results of the populist movements all over the world, I think, is that governmental policies are becoming rather reactive than proactive. They are dealing with instantaneous elements of the global picture and devising policies that are meant to look nice or look good on Twitter or in Facebook. This is a major handicap to which academia is called to address through putting in place or adding a more strategic vision, especially when you're dealing with a region like the MENA region, which is a region full of complexities and full of nuance, which should be understood before trying to outline a policy that has a chance to succeed. So what I will try to do is just to throw some elements to trigger a debate, hopefully afterwards, and trying to put things in a historic perspective, because history, when it comes to our region, to the south, is very important, and it's still weighing a lot on our present. But first, I wish to say that the responsibility for the current state of play for the current situation in the region is really a shared responsibility, a joint responsibility. It doesn't help, and it's not accurate, neither historically nor morally, to say that the Muslim world or the Arab world or the southern neighborhood should find alone the solutions. The responsibility is shared. I think if we go back in history and try to see what went wrong, I would suggest one line of thinking, but there are others. One line of thinking is that immediately after decolonization, the young, fresh, post-colonial regimes were not originally authoritarian, but they inherited a societal configuration after 400 years of stagnation under the Ottoman rule. They inherited a societal configuration which is totally tribal. And I think the same configuration today still exists. The actual societal configuration in the region is still tribal, and by tribe, I mean any subnational identity. It could be tribe, but it could also be religious. It could also be a family affiliation or a regional affiliation. This is the configuration that the young regimes, the post-colonial young regimes inherited. And it come on them. They had the duty and the challenge to make this transformative transition from a tribal society into a national society on a national platform. This is not meant to justify the course that they took, which led them to become authoritarian regime. This is meant to just explain and analyze in order to better devise solutions. They were immediately faced by heavy international interests and policies. I can speak of the Cold War. I can speak of the Palestine question in 1948 and on other major upheavals in the region. So these regimes became more responsive to what they pursued as existential threat coming from outside. So what mattered to them is not to seek legitimacy from inside, but rather to locate themselves in the regional and international configuration and the Cold War logic and others, to simply just save their place in this configuration. And they never were interested in trying really to approach this tribal societal configuration in order to seek real legitimacy. And by legitimacy, I don't mean the legitimacy in legal terms, but legitimacy when it comes to a state of acceptance by the population for this nascent nation state. They went also exactly to an opposite direction. Instead of focusing on the inside of their societies and try to work for this national identity and to break these subnational tribal identities, they resorted to going towards the transnational ideologies like pan-Arabism, like third worldism, like international socialism, as a way to transcend the challenges that are needed to address the identity problem in their societies. And the international policies which were devised all across the 30s, 40s, 50s up to now never really were interested in trying to accompany this region in its nation-building process, which was interrupted by this geopolitical situation. International actors didn't have the time nor probably the energy to allow for such an extended process of nation building. They needed, they were taken always by short-term interest, which were pursued. Simply the process of nation building was interrupted, and it never took place as it should have. And these regimes, which again were not originally authoritarian, later derailed, and I think becoming authoritarian is the default choice, especially when they were faced with these identities. Today, if we see what's taking place in the MENA region, religion is being viewed as an identity, simply because there is no alternative identity. Religion is the most immediate identity that the individual tends to belong to, if he is not offered an alternative through a modern state that could make him abandon this subnational identity. Now, some elements for the future. I think there is a drastic need for a change of course to address the region. First, it has to be accepted that this is a shared responsibility. This is something very, very important. Second, I think it doesn't help to international policies should think big, should come to the region with big ideas. What is really lacking today in the region is what I call a mega structure of stability, a mega structure of macro stability in the region, an architecture that guarantees the stability of the region. If you see today what's taking place in different crises in the region, you see that the actors that are the most relevant on the ground are not accounted for in a mega structure. So all what they can do, and this is not meant to justify, but all what they can do is to exercise their effet de nuisance, as we say, simply because there is no large mega context that organizes, that states what are the rights and obligations of different actors. So I think this goal, this collective security system for the region, which should be a factual and away from political calculations, is heavily lacking today. And unless we devise such a foundation for stability in the region, I think whatever we do would be like working on the upper level of a building while the foundations are hollow or simply non-existent. Even if we talk about counterterrorism today, can anybody convince me or be convinced that the counterterrorism efforts in the region are merely taking place in a counterterrorism logic without any political calculations, not wanting, for example, to to inflict a vacuum on the balance, on the equilibrium of forces in order not for our opponent to come and fill all these political calculations arise from the fact that there is no real macro system for stability in the region. So I think this is one of the main elements that should be addressed in approaching the region. This does not mean, of course, that we do not adopt short-term or even immediate-term policies to address some elements, mainly terrorism. But we don't need to fall into being selective. I think one of the threats or one of the uncertainties on the current international policies that are being practiced in the region is to fall into selective engagement. We just put aside, for example, two elements, terrorism and migration, and this is all what we need to address in the region. These two elements are only sub-products of a larger crisis, of a larger turmoil that should be addressed. The third element in the international policies which are needed is not to fall into political score point with the populist movements. You would never be able to beat them. I think the only way to deal with them is to give the right example. In Europe, I think these populist movements remain a transitory phenomena, and the best thing about democracy is that it autocorrects. So I think we shouldn't be alarmed, while acknowledging that some governments also indirectly worked for the rise of these populist movements by certain policies, like, for example, over-representing the migration crisis. If you take the migration crisis in Europe, it involves 1.5 migrant and refugee. What's 1.5 millions for a population of 500 millions in Europe, when you have a country like Lebanon with a population of 4 millions and hosting 1.5 millions. So I think this alarming tone by governments and media, it helped the rise of these populist movements. But this is, I think, once again, something that is auto-correctable, and I think we're starting to see the trend moving to another direction. I will stop at this point. I think I managed to keep my 8 minutes pledged. Thank you, and I'll be looking forward for the debate.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, the Ambassador Murtada didn't address the concept of radicalization directly, but by insinuation, highlighting some key issues, key points. The first is geography is overwhelmed by long history. I mean, the present is not orphan. The present has a history, and we have to take into account the historical background of the Arab and MENA region. The second key idea, the responsibility is shared. We used to focus on the young radicalized Muslims, but we don't take into consideration the geopolitical environment, mainly the role played by international actors in our region for the sake of their own interests, and not necessarily to democratize or to bring our regimes, to make our regime more democratic. So there is a source of humiliation and alienation. Those regimes, after the independence, turn their backs to the population, adopting big mega concepts like pan-Arabism or like third worldism, and forgetting to consolidate the very national sovereignty and the democracy process in their own country. This makes that the state turns its back to the society and then to the individual. So there has been a double sense of alienation of the individual with regard to the state, and alienation of the societies with regard to the behavior of the international actors. Did I catch your idea? Well, I think that this is, for our conference, this has been a new addition, which is valuable, and we shall take care in our report to mention that. So the word now, since you ended by speaking about populism in Europe, who is better than Rosa Balfour to speak about that? You know, Rosa Balfour is, first of all, a great friend of EuroMeSCo and IEMed, and a great friend of us all. She is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Prior to joining the Marshall Fund, Rosa Balfour headed the Europe in the World program at the European Policy Center. And what is the chance? Her last book is entitled Europe's Troublemakers, the Populist Challenge to Foreign Policy. Since this issue has not very much been tackled in this conference, we are expecting your contribution with great pleasure. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and be as focused as possible because, is it on? Yes, okay, as focused as possible because it's a very broad topic around which there's actually a lot of confusion, okay? So what I'm going to try and do is just say very few words about why populism has been so successful. I'm going to try and focus on the ways in which populism impacts foreign policy making, foreign policy decisions. And then I'm going to questioning actually some of the assumptions that are commonly held. And then I'm going to address just some sort of, given that this is a what shall we do panel, I'm going to offer some suggestions as to how to break that cycle. As I said, there's a lot of explanations about the rise of populism, and I think there's a lot of confusion between symptoms and causes. We've seen a lot of talk in the press about those left behind, the Rust Belt, that basically we can group the explanations and we can put the explanations in two groupings. One is about culture and identity. So they will see migration pressure as a big trigger for populism, and the other one would be the socioeconomic consequences of globalization. So people who have a more of a socioeconomic interpretation, and in that case, unemployment, economic crises, etc., could be the trigger for populism. I would actually like to add a third group, which I think is actually the most important, both in terms of understanding causes, symptoms, political context in which populism can thrive, but also part of the solution. And this is far less frequently made, but it's about the erosion of the quality of democracy, certainly in advanced democracies in Europe and in the US, and the quality of political participation, of democratic life of citizens. And that's where a lot of exclusion is felt. And that's where institutions and political leaders lose legitimacy in the eyes of citizens. And this is caused partly by globalization, partly by Europeanization, and the transfer of decision-making power away from the nation and away from the citizen. But it's also due to the crisis of the existing traditional political system, which is what the populists started to attack. But how do populists work? How do they manage to influence the debate? And I would argue that actually the rise of populism has been a resistible rise, that many more things could have been done to block it, to stem it. There will be an element of physiological existence of parties and groupings which contest the way we organize our political life, but it need not be quite so strong. And I think that's a very important point. Of course, we've seen how successful populists have been in capturing the debate, at running the news cycle. And this is tied to the crisis of the business sector, of the media. It's tied to all sorts of issues I don't really want to go into. What I really want to focus on is the relationship between populist parties and movements and mainstream, or what we call mainstream, what we used to call mainstream political parties, because of course now, populism has actually become mainstream in some parts of the world. So, and if you look at the rise of political parties, of populist political parties, especially those which are located on the far right of the political spectrum, they have been extremely successful in influencing centre-right political parties. But it's centre-right political parties, centre-right political governments that have actually made the decisions to pursue policies which reflect the preferences of populists. We have seen this, of course, now in the UK with the Brexit vote, that actually the populist party that triggered the whole debate on the referendum no longer exists. You don't need that political party if the theme, the topic, the mobilizing factor is taken on entirely by the mainstream, or what used to be a mainstream political party, the Conservative Party. And we've seen, of course, in the US, how the Republican Party has managed to be captured entirely by an outsider and shifted the debate and the political policy preferences of the Republicans as well. So this is one trend where it's actually the party, centre-right traditional party, which is taking on entirely the policy proposals of the populists. Other cases, of course, where we see that even without embracing entirely that agenda, the policy preferences of parties in government, traditional parties in government, adopt policies which respond to the preferences of populists by arguing that there is no alternative. We are under pressure and therefore need to deliver something which wouldn't be what we would have chosen, but we have no alternative. So we've had a great rise in there is no alternative narratives, which have actually reduced the space for democratic debate in the rest of society. And actually, that's where a lot of the left-outs are. It's not those who have decided to embrace populists. Often it's those populism. It's also those who have who choose to embrace different, more liberal and pluralist values, who are not represented any longer by traditional politics. So what does this mean? What have we seen as consequences so far on policy, on foreign policy in particular? I'll go through this fairly quickly because I think I'm running out of time. One clear area that we have seen is restrictive migration policies, and this is not happening just now. It's been happening for the past 20 years in Europe, and largely thanks to the rising importance of these political parties and the ways in which mainstream parties have responded to them. Secondly, cuts to foreign aid. Obviously, we're seeing this in the US, but there's going to be push in that direction also in other countries in Europe if that narrative is not changed. We're seeing, and this is happening as we speak, securitization of foreign policy, and even in many cases, militarization of foreign policy, to the expense of more comprehensive approaches, more holistic approaches. And also what we're seeing, which I think possibly is actually the issue of most consequence, is a trend towards renationalization and more transactional politics taking place in the various fora for international cooperation. And of course, in Europe, the European Union is the core one. Now, what can be done to break the cycle? The first thing is that we are actually seeing a few political leaders who are beginning to recognize that the debate can be framed differently, and that political actors can actually be proactive in that sense and not just be responding to the populist challenge. We've seen that, first of all, we saw that in Austria with the presidential election. It was close. It doesn't mean that populists are not strong, but the president actually reframed the debate in a certain way that a majority of Austrians preferred. And Macron is doing exactly the same. He's taking leadership and trying to frame issues rather than respond to the ways in which populists provoke. So fortunately, there is beginning to be some kind of change in the political landscape, because until very recently, the whole of Europe was basically under the threat of the populist surge, which was tying everybody's hands, and therefore it was impossible to find any policy solution to problems which actually are solvable. And I'm thinking in particular of the 2015-16 refugee influx. So reframe the debate and provide alternative, not just solutions, provide alternative ways of addressing things, and do that. Again, try to capture the news cycle, just like as the populists do. There's a few things that perhaps can be learned, and question the narrative about being under a populist siege. I think it's very important, and that's where think tanks can also play a big role. But more broadly, if one accepts that the erosion of democratic life is one of the causes of all this, then it also has to be one of the solutions. And I think we need to recognize that representative democracy as we know it has shown its limits. And it's not by introducing elements of direct democracy, such as referendums, that we're going to solve this problem. So we need to think about how to reform institutions. We need to think about how to make political life much more participative, much more inclusive, not just in policies, but also in practices, in processes, in reaching out to different groups. Political parties clearly no longer play that function of transmission belts and accountability between institutions and government and citizens. On the other hand, there are other groups out there, including think tanks, NGOs, civil society sector, that are working, that can provide, that need to be included in the processes, both in terms of designing policies, but also just in terms of democratic practice. So innovation and reform is needed, will be needed. And I think in this context, it's very important to give voice to those who have shouted less loud than the populists, and they've been obscured by the debate. We're seeing, in many cases, majoritarian politics taking over, but with very, very slim majorities, and in some cases, with minorities. So more broadly, politics needs to address the causes of the polarization of our societies, and it needs to do that through democratic practices. And only that way can we design foreign policies and external policies which will be more fit for the purpose. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to have an intervention specifically centered on the question of populism. And you addressed, as we addressed the root causes of radicalization, you addressed the root causes of populism. And the main ideas have been captured by all the audience. It is what is perceived as the erosion of the democratic life through professionalism of political elite, through corruption, through disconnection of the political elites from the popular grievances and the popular demands. So they are anti-elite, they are anti-big government, they are anti-Europe. The second is that they perceive that there is a blurring, dividing line between traditional political parties. I mean, what is the recipe of a socialist party and a Republican Party in France, for example? So they don't perceive the difference. So they are offering new recipes to solve not only the identity crisis but also the economic crisis. So they think that the traditional parties are incapable of addressing the social and identity and economic issues. That's why they adopt restrictive policies on migration. They want to cut foreign aid, as Rosa has said, and they want to knock down the European Union itself, going back to the national state. They think they are better advocates of the good people against the bad people. So they are divisive in their perspective, but the root causes are linked to economy, to identity, and to the perception that they are left aside and that the government doesn't take care of their immediate problems. Well, I would like to ask later, Rosa, if the impoverishment of the middle classes in Europe through the destructive effect of unregulated globalization is not also a significant root causes for the surge of populism, populist ideology. Let us switch again to the question of radicalization. And here at my left, I have a friend of a long period, François Burga, and he will tell us what the difference he makes between the dysfonctionnement économique, political dysfunctioning, and the radical ideology. As you know, François Burga is almost chairs a school of thought in France, and he is at variance with other French experts who wrote on the problem of Islamism and radicalization. So without entering in this debate between him, Gilles Kepel, and Olivier Roy, well, let us first listen to him telling us in 8-10 minutes what the difference he makes between politics and ideology.
Merci beaucoup, Bishara. Thank you to the chairman and the organizers for allowing us to meet today. The challenge of the concluding session is that you have no excuse for not being ready. You've had plenty of time, but also that you have the feeling that you ought to address at least some of what has been said, wrap up some of your major impressions after these very fruitful 2 days. The issue we address is sophisticated, is complicated, therefore there shouldn't be a black and white response. Nevertheless, I do not intend to be scientifically correct, and I shall use some black and white. Why? I heard, like, for instance, this morning, the Syrian crisis is so complicated that, we no longer dare say where is the evil and where is the good. No, I think that although it requires some sophistication, this should not deprive us of saying things more or less clearly, knowing that the few minutes we invest can be approached through reading many pages all of us have written and which are accessible thanks to Google. I do not know if you know that Ibn Taymiyyah has a grave in a corner of the University of Damascus. It's covered with garbage. It's no longer, there is no mention of his name and of whatever he has done. And this morning I was kind of joking ironically, and I said, I'm wondering whether Mr. Bashar al-Assad ought not to be more thankful to Ibn Taymiyyah. What did I mean? The title I give to my lecture is, the problem we are facing, is it the responsibility of Ibn Taymiyyah, what brings us together today, or is it your responsibility and mine, all of us, whether we are on the southern side of the Mediterranean or on the northern side? And believe me or not, I don't buy the Ibn Taymiyyah explanation. I'm tired of the Ibn Taymiyyah explanation. And since we had yesterday a few pages of Ibn Taymiyyah explanation.
But could you explain what is Ibn Taymiyyah?
Ibn Taymiyyah is a Muslim scholar who is more or less identified to political radicalism. Okay?
Yes.
So, do we blame the ideology of the other? Or do we get into a little more intense intellectual effort and we go into the story of why is it not so many people? Why is it that a few people have the idea in front of the many ways which they could appropriate their religion in the field of politics? Why do they go to the radical side of the supermarket? This is the problematic. I had promised that we would balance some French and English. So, when I was looking for my English, giving a lecture in Harvard 20 years ago, a friend of mine, Iraqi born, he said, Francois, whenever you lack one word in English, you face the audience, you say it slowly in French, and then we say, hey, this has to be the new concept by Bourdieu, which we did not learn yet. So I will recall to a few words of this type of conference the good side of not being too young is that we had some kind of tradition. Has been built for years, 25, 30, on a line, on a traditional line. People representing, by the way, I'm glad to be sitting next to a gentleman who, as a government representative, cannot be accused of authoritarianism, because the Lebanese state is not strong enough to be authoritarian. So, no, it's good. It's also a choice, but I mean, it's the fact that it's true. Lebanon has never been blamed as being an authoritarian regime, okay? So, the story of these meetings, we would have people coming from a land or lands where I'm going to be a little provocative. No, don't take it by the word, but you fill up the ballot boxes with your right hand and you fill up the jails with your left hand. You know, this was more or less the political recipe. So these people would come and explain to us Europeans who do not know what the hell is going on in these faraway countries of the South, that it was Ibn Taymiyyah's fault. And we would listen to this explanation, this delicious explanation. Why did we like this type of explanation? Because it exonerates us as much as he who produces this explanation of any kind of responsibility. So we like the Ibn Taymiyyah explanation. It's the good one. It's the one which blames not even the other, the culture of the other. The responsibility of political violence is on the culture, misunderstanding, miskin, is not got the right, is put it the wrong side, his level of knowledge of Islam is not sufficient. Okay, we like this type of explanation. I think that we must move beyond this type of explanation. Is it that we should support radical ideologies? No, of course not. It is, it was my privilege 3 months ago, although I'm not a Muslim, I want to make it clear, but I was the guest of the Majlis al-Urubi lil-Fatwa wa Dirasat, sitting next to Sheikh Qardawi, and trying to assess from a Muslim point of view what should be the reaction to political extremism. And we came to the conclusion that it is really important to condemn radical ideologies, but there should be one step beyond. And the step beyond is, why is it that people choose when they have so many other possibilities? Why is it that they choose the radical understanding of their religion? This should be the real question. This should be the issue that we should address. Where are the answers? They are not so complicated. Political violence is always related to the dysfunctioning of the political institutions which distribute the resources, not the economic resources only, the symbolic resources, political representation, okay? Why is it that the extremists in Iraq, they left the extremity of the society and they moved toward the center for the first time in history? Why is it that people in Mosul, well, they did not, all of them, struggle real hard when they saw that Daesh was part of the landscape? Why is it? It is because there was a total failure of the institutions of the center, okay? So that's rather good news. The extremists move toward the centers when there is a total failure of the institution. Now, let's add to the landscape. There is a total failure of central institutions in the history of contemporary jihadism. I know this word does not have the same meaning in Arabic, but let's say jihadism, the bad guys. The bad guys in the contemporary scale of time, they appeared when the institutions of a country fell apart, but never did they fall apart without some foreign help. In Afghanistan, Soviet help, then American help. In Iraq, major American help. Then it's not only the Westerners. Iranian help. Then Russian help in the frame of the Syrian context. So if we move away from the cheap idea that the culture of the other is responsible, if we distribute a little more evenly the responsibilities between us all, we find then there is a little more hope, because it is very difficult to de-radicalize the other. But it might be a little easier to change our own way of addressing this issue. So this should be some kind of optimistic conclusion. Thank you for your attention.
Well, he put the argument in very, very clear terms, and it is so convincing. And I really share most of what has been said personally. But the exoneration of us, of what is happening in the Middle East, not just that saying that the evil is the culture of the other. So this puts into question the very notion of de-radicalization. So make the other more moderate, more open, more dialogic, more democratic. And this exonerates us from our own responsibilities. He spoke about Afghanistan. He spoke about the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. He didn't mention the Arab-Israeli question. We are commemorating today 50 years of occupation of our land. So has it a link with the radicalization processes? Well, this means in some that radicalization is not a condition, it is a process, and we have to understand this process. Thank you very much. So the last contribution is from Henry Barkey. And Henry Barkey is currently Turkish. Still Turk? No, okay. So I should not mention it. Is currently the director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where he has also served as public policy scholar on the project The Iraq War and Beyond, the Remaking of Iraq's Neighborhood. So the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. So I was, in terms of the division of labor, I'm supposed to talk about authoritarianism. I mean, let me just say, I mean, many people have much better than me have written about authoritarianism, but I will, shall we say, plead my case today by reminding you of Jorge Luis Borges's short story about the man who's rewriting Don Quixote. And as he writes Don Quixote, he replicates word for word the Cervantes's work. And so when he's asked, why are you doing this? It says exactly the same thing. Oh no, he says, it's much better. Why? Because it's contemporary. So what I'm going to do today is kind of not be really better, but try to look at it in the context of authoritarianism and its solutions in terms of the context of today. I mean, let's face it, authoritarianism is a condition, a human condition if you want. It's permanent. It's a permanent one that exists in many different forms, and whenever it finds a suitable environment, almost like a disease, it will appear when you least expect it. And not only is authoritarianism a condition, it also takes many different forms. I mean, you can think of the authoritarian personality and think of Trump for a moment. Who would have thought that the United States would elect essentially an authoritarian personality of the type of Trump? But it happened. But authoritarianism, of course, is most associated with the international state system that we are also attached to it. Everybody wants a state. The state is the focus of all our attention, and the state is what really in many ways identifies us, defines us, and we all have passports, we all have some kind of number somewhere. But it is the needs of governance, the permanence of conflict between states, the institutions created to deal with these issues that make for authoritarian constructions, i.e. the state by nature is authoritarian. But of course, some countries, some states, some societies have managed to control and moderate the authoritarian instinct. Those we call democracies. But for many, democracy is a continuous struggle, or the process is a continuous struggle. And it is not. And it is not a linear one. I mean, it is not one where you progress continuously towards one goal. And I would just like to draw your attention to two cases in two different parts of the world. One is Venezuela, and the other one is Turkey. Venezuela, which for many, many years had this wonderful, somewhat oligarchic, you would say, two-party system that was peaceful, that transitioned. You had political transition, peaceful political transition. And what happened? One person, Chavez, managed to essentially completely upend the system. He did it because he was lucky. He benefited from economic rents, which meant that he could buy people off. But in the process, you see what's happening today in Venezuela. I mean, it has declined into a completely failed state. And it would have happened even if Chavez had not died. But I remember when Venezuela used to be, compared to the rest of Latin America, shown as an example of one of those democratic societies, and look what it is. Turkey, of course, was never fully democratic. You had military regimes, you had a kind of restrictive democracy. But there was a period, and I know some people in this room will disagree, but there was a period in the early 2000s when you thought that Turkey was moving towards democracy. And yet, with the constitutional referendum of a few weeks ago, the Turkish political system also has been upended by one person. Again, just like Chavez had enormous impact in transforming a system that had institutions, here in Turkey too, now you have one person who has completely redefined and remade the institutions in his own image, and essentially has now complete control, if you want, of the state. And he's turning it, just like Chavez did, into essentially a personalistic regime. But look, I mean, all is not, of course, doom and gloom. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Franco. I'm old enough to remember Pinochet. And if you look at both Spain, which has a rigorous democracy, and Chile today, which is seen as one of the most democratic countries in South America, when there was a period of coups after coups in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, etc. And today, things have moved, things have changed. So things do change. Now, the problem is that the region we are most interested in, the MENA region, the region that people here are dealing with, is to some extent a little bit different. It's different in the following sense. It has had continuous and persistent authoritarianism for basically, you can say, maybe 4 reasons. One is, again, just like in the Venezuela case, economic rents. You would say, of course, it's oil-derived rents, but all these rents were also distributed in those countries that did not receive. But if you look at all of the Gulf, Libya at one point, Algeria, Iraq, so the rents that were derived from this plentiful, bountiful product called oil essentially enabled to buy people off, and people did not complain as long as you provided them with some basic services. But to make sure that people, in case they complained, you created also let me rephrase this. The institutionalization that occurred in most of these societies is a kind of what passed for institutions were security services, armies, secret police, and so on and so forth. Right? So that was what really institutions were about. Third, foreign support. I mean, there was a way in which, and this is not just the West, but it's also Russia. It's also before Russia, the Soviet Union. There was always some, if you want, external complicity with the authoritarian regimes that inhabited the area. Fourth, I would argue that there is a certain regional, maybe you can even say it's the, shall we say, non-kosher word, so to say, a cultural homogeneity that has enabled the creation of some kind of a demonstration effect across the region. So think of, for example, Nasser, and how Nasser's coup essentially was deemed, of course, a revolution, and essentially became something that appealed to a great deal in the Arab world. And you had out of that, you had the two Ba'athi regimes in Syria and Iraq, and that emerged. So you do have essentially a demonstration, and you saw, of course, that demonstration effect with the Arab Spring. I mean, it started in Tunisia, and it spread across the region. It didn't spread to other parts of the world. It spread only in a certain restricted area. So you do have this, if you want, this cultural demonstration effect, and there's a sense in which the region, because of language, etc., history, is very much tied to each other. And that makes, in some ways, the spread of authoritarianism or the maintenance of authoritarianism easier. So, but when you look at the region in general, I mean, it's difficult to generalize, obviously, and it is somewhat simplistic, that you see two types of regimes, right? On the one hand, you have the monarchies that have, say for Bahrain, proven to be fairly stable and have by and large also genuinely escaped foreign pressure, and they have used essentially rents and the monarchy as a substitute institution to get consent. But then you have the other regimes that morphed into personalistic, despotic structures where a family or a man dominated all aspects of the political system. Obviously, Syria, Iraq, Libya are the showcases. And in these cases, the leader has eviscerated the little that existed in terms of institutions and played the differences in societies, groups, against each other in order to maintain power. And you realize that, of course, with that, there really was no institution. And the best proof, of course, is the current situation in Syria, whereby the fact that no solution can be conceived and the fact that the fighting has been so intense and the inability to come up with institutions because of the dearth of institutions before the collapse. Similarly, the Americans, when they went into Iraq, thought, oh my God, we're going to bring democracy, we're going to create elections. Sure, there were elections, but that clearly is not what is what democracy was all about today, and we see the results today in Iraq. But the other, of course, weapon that these regimes used was war. I mean, war, and you can even make the argument that Saddam and certainly the Caliph Baghdadi are very good students of Charles Tilly, who, remember, said the state made war and war made the state. I mean, in that sense, this was another instrument, and that explains some of the chaos that exists. So what is the answer? I mean, first of all, I think we have to dissociate the notion of elimination of democracy, the elimination of authoritarianism with democracy. These are two very distinct processes. And in between those two, maybe a period of transition, you call it, whatever you want to call it, but they're not sequential. I mean, they're sequential to the extent that, of course, you have to get rid of authoritarianism first, but then you're not going to move to democracy immediately. The question is, what comes in between? And given the situation in the Middle East today, I mean, what I will argue, and I'm going to make, it's to some extent it's unrealistic, but it is also, it's the absence of a solution, is decentralization. Maximum decentralization. The only way I think we will get societies to recreate themselves, to restructure themselves, create some coherence, is if we can figure out a way of decentralizing politics. And also, there's a wonderful article, I forget, Sarah Campbell, I think, who looked at the British discussions and the British decision what to do with Mosul at the turn of the century. And the British had 4 different emissaries, if you want, go and talk to different people in the region. And remember, that part of the country at the time was very, very pluralistic. I mean, you had Armenians, you had Yazidis, you had Turkomans, you had Kurds, you had Arabs, you had Jews. And the cacophony of preferences that emerged. Some people wanted the British to stay. Others wanted to join Iraq. Some wanted to stay with Turkey. Others wanted to become independent. But there was, and the British essentially did what they wanted to do, in part because they couldn't, they didn't know what to do. But the point there is that most of these people made these decisions not because they were a Kurd or a Turk or an Arab, but very often their own special interests. Some people said that the Turks imposed too high, the British imposed too high tariffs, so they preferred to stay within whatever with Turkey. Others thought that the Turks had been very nasty to them, so they wanted the British. And some said, look, we want to be independent. Right? But what I'm trying to get to is that we need to figure out a system, and I don't know how to do it, but we need to come up with a system whereby decision-making is pushed as far down as possible and kind of dissociate the centralizing state from local decision-making, encourage people to organize at the local level, and eventually rebuild the state from the bottom up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, the argument deserves another big conference, really. I was stunned by the very beginning of your lecture, saying that the state, by its very nature, is authoritarian. But in democracy, this authoritarianism tendency is controlled. But the state, because it is sovereign, because it benefits from the legitimate violence, is authoritarian. And democracy controls and frames this authoritarianism. You told us that some authoritarian countries may become democratic, and you gave the example of Spain. Other democratic countries may turn authoritarian. Well, in the case of the Arab world, we had also authoritarian countries evolving in their authoritarianism. We had the Nasser authoritarianism is more paternalist, more patriarchal. The Mubarak authoritarianism is more predatory, and the Bashar al-Assad authoritarianism is more dynastic. I mean, Gaddafi was preparing his sons to succeed him, and Ben Ali was doing the same, and Ali Saleh was doing the same, and Saddam Hussein was doing the same. So the authoritarianism has evolved during the 60 last years. They're very interesting arguments, and the last argument. You insisted very much on the question of decentralization. I mean, a sort of intermediate force that would consolidate democracy, but from bottom up. Thank you very much. Well, we have sufficient time. Rosa will leave us around 4 o'clock for 10. So if you have any questions addressed to her first, they will be welcome. Yes.
Jawad Kadoudi, je suis président de l'Institut marocain des relations internationales. Et ma question s'adresse à Monsieur l'ambassadeur Rami Mortada. Je partage avec lui, évidemment, des analyses sur les causes de la situation actuelle de la région MENA et surtout sur la responsabilité partagée, et notamment celle des États-Unis qui ont envahi l'Irak et la Syrie et qui nous ont mis dans cette situation actuelle. Alors, vous proposez la solution, il faut construire les fondations de la paix et de la sécurité dans la région MENA. Je suis d'accord avec vous, mais la question que je vous pose, quels pourraient être les acteurs de cette fondation? Lorsqu'on voit l'Europe affaiblie et divisée, lorsqu'on voit les États-Unis avec Donald Trump qui dit « America First », lorsqu'on voit la Russie qui cherche uniquement des cibles sélectives, telles que vous les avez dit, alors que l'Afrique et l'Asie sont en train de s'occuper de leurs problèmes économiques et développement et que l'ONU est impuissante. Donc, Monsieur l'ambassadeur, qui va réellement faire cette fondation que vous avez demandée?
Are we going to answer immediately or to give the floor for two other questions? Okay, one, please make your questions clear and eventually short. Please.
Thank you very much. I have 3 points to make that cut across the presentations. One is an important point raised by Ambassador Mortada. He mentioned the tribal nature of societies that did not actually, according to him, achieve an identity compatible with a nation. I have a slight intervention to make with respect to that in fact, to call a sub-national identity religion does a little disservice to your argument, in the sense that the religious identity very often is, in fact, an identity also not only with family tribe, but it could be an identity with ummah. So I think what we are really talking about in unfashionable and classic terms of sociology is really an undifferentiated society that has simple, undifferentiated, common value systems. And that could be tribe, and that could be ummah. And how do you reach, actually the question would be, how do you reach a differentiated and therefore more cosmopolitan society, which is essential for tolerance. Number two, Rosa, I'm very glad that you brought the question of institutions, but where I would also underline the fact that institutions are necessary, and that institutions in democracies are not subject to political fluctuations of votes or majority. I mean, that is why, in fact, it is very important to have constitutions, which are essentially charters. Constitutions are physiology of a state and not constantly changeable laws, which basically is a point that is often missed by politicians, decision makers, and by a lot of academics also, that confuse the issue of democracy. And with respect to that, my third point is to Henri, where the important thing there is that institutions are the role, the essential role of the state is to enforce independent legal decisions. And in order to have independent legal decisions, you have to have strong independent judiciary. So it is both the institutions that are important, but also the fact that the role of the state is essentially very important to achieve democracy, because if you do not have a strong state to impose contracts, then you cannot have.
I think you made your point clear.
I hope I did, yes.
Yeah. So let us answer these questions, because Rosa has to leave us. Rosa, would you begin with the second point of our friend Ahmed?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say, actually, I'm quite struck by the fact that although we all addressed quite different issues, I think there's one thread that binds us, and that is the sense of the shared responsibility, as the ambassador put it earlier, how the political centre has let itself be captured, or has used populist parties as a fig leaf to justify policies that they were pursuing anyway. And I think similar points about radicalization and the sense of responsibility. And it really requires, I think, a different level of analysis. Ditto with authoritarianism and the relationship of the West in promoting that. So that's the first thing that really struck me, actually, because we were really talking about widely divergent, different issues in many respects, but that's the thread. So in the what needs to be done piece, there's something that is actually analysis. We need to look back and look at ourselves in greater depth and question some of our assumptions and be critical in order to identify ways forward. Institutions, constitutions, I think what the big challenge is, and that is certainly in Western European politics, but also in identity politics, in conflict situations, who changes? And that's the big question. And how can you move that? How can you enlarge the democratic community on the one hand, and therefore that might require constitutional change or institutional change. I mean, I certainly think institutions need to change the way in which they're representative of their people in democracies, but who is it who decides? And that's the contestation that the populists are bringing to the political arena. They are saying these traditional parties are not performing, and we do, and we want to change things because that's and the other side is trying to delegitimize or demonize, etc. So we're not. So I don't think even in advanced so-called advanced democracies, I don't think we know exactly under what conditions these changes can take place or should not take place, as you said. I mean, you don't want to change constitutions every year, but how do you decide how societies are changing? And then Bishara, you asked something about the middle classes earlier. I'm not. There's been a lot of talk about the sort of class dimension and the impacts of globalization on various categories. I think we're seeing very different phenomena and very different in various countries, which relate to the way in which culture, history, the way in which states are organized. But I think perhaps what we ought to think about is the impacts of technological change, because that's where the real revolution is taking place, and it's hitting, indeed, the middle classes, but some are going up and some are going down. And then more globally, elsewhere, the middle classes are growing. In the West, they're shrinking. Elsewhere, they're growing, but they're fragile. So I think these are the dimensions that need to be looked at. The impacts of technological change, which in many respects is quite difficult to forecast. I have time until 4:15, I believe, so I can always pick a few extra pieces up later.
Thank you. Henry,
So, Ahmed, I agree. I mean, the notion that you're talking about is the famous Karl Marx notion of the relative autonomy of a state. I mean, that the state is somehow floats above and independently of everything. But that said, institutions are not just those kind of the anchor institutions like the constitution or the judicial system that you talk about. Societies are full of other institutions. Labor unions are institutions. Business organizations are institutions. I mean, so some of these institutions do change, right? So we have to mind that. On the question of the middle class, just want to add one thing to what Rosa said. Look, there is a major transformation going on today, obviously, because of what Rosa said, the technological change. But think back. There was one before, when we went into the industrial age, where agriculture lost its importance, and that had certain political consequences, right? So we are essentially experiencing the political consequences of the current transition, but we should know how to deal with it because we've experienced it before.
What we're lacking today is the microphone. What we're lacking today is not leadership in the proper sense of the term. What we're lacking is the right leadership, and I think this includes also leadership from within the region. Any approach towards the region, I think, should be tri-dimensional. There should be a mature and intelligent international circle, then immediately followed by a regional circle which deploys leadership, and then by national in each country, particularly the countries which are witnessing crises. If you look today at the Syria crisis, for example, can anybody tell me where is the Syrian component of the Syria crisis? It has been immediately hijacked by different actors from all sides, and its only connection to Syria today is that Syria is the theater of operation, but what we're witnessing in Syria is an international and a regional showdown. So I think there is a need for a tri-dimensional leadership on the international level, building a solid foundation of understandings that work for or that advance the security of the region, and then followed on top by a regional floor, and at last we reach the national floor in every country. And unless we proceed by this, through this sequence, I don't see that focusing on the upper floor would help much, simply because the foundation is not there. So the leadership exists, but it's being nowadays from all sides, I think, deployed in the wrong direction towards political accounts and settlement of political accounts that do not necessarily have to do with the real interest of the region. And that brings us back to what Mr. Barkey had said, that the opposite of an authoritarian regime is not immediately a democratic regime. It's an evolution rather than a revolution. But this evolution should come according to the real needs of the country in question, and not be immediately hijacked or entered into foreign calculations which derail this evolution and at the same time complicate the resolution of the crisis. On religious identity, yes, I agree. Sometimes transcending could lead us to supranational identities, but in both cases, whether the identity is subnational or supranational, the victim is the state. I think today what the main challenge in the region is to put in place again the concept of the state, an accountable state, of course, that is accountable to its people, but beyond that, that enjoys the, I don't want to use the term legitimacy, that enjoys the acceptance, and by acceptance I mean a deep psychological feeling that this individual, which the track record has led him to feel as subject, how can we make this quantum leap, this transformative transition into becoming a citizen? And this is a reciprocal exercise that is needed from the modern states to be, and from their population also. And I can add a third dimension, which is the international encouragement, a positive encouragement, and let the homegrown process evolve in the right direction. So this Ummah identity, actually, it has also been used by we mentioned Third Worldism, we mentioned Pan-Arabism, but we can easily say Pan-Islamism. All these transcending ideologies are, in fact, historically were used to try to evade or sideline the challenge that the modern post-colonial states had, which is to address the societal configuration and help their populations to make this transformative transition towards becoming citizen of a modern state. And they themselves derailed towards becoming authoritarian, and I think this is by default derail. I think any government becomes by default authoritarian unless it's checked and balanced. So this is the natural derail that has taken place. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, my question will be for Dr. Balfour, and I should first say that I agree that the democratic exclusion or exclusion in political participation is a main cause, an important cause of rise of populism. But I also believe that there has been some initiatives, some steps taken on European level, if not on national level. Because when you think about the latest European parliamentary elections, there it was the time the parliament was, and the voters therefore was given the power to influence the European Commission presidency elections, and it was the time of presidential debates that was broadcasted online so that the candidates can face each other in front of public, or it was the time the European Parliament launched this programs, you know, I think they were titled like Act, React, Impact, or this time it is different, to raise awareness among public and increase the voter turnout. I think these, you know, steps, these strategies were to the point to, you know, tackle this problem, but none of them actually worked. Maybe they even backfired because the voter turnout was less than 40%. And yeah, just one last thing. It was the time the radical populist parties actually, you know, gained victory over the mainstream was all over the world, continent. I'm sorry. So my question is, what went wrong back then, and how can we make sure that it doesn't happen again with the future initiatives? Thank you.
Thank you, Bichara. My name is Professor Marquina. I'm Madrid University, UNISTI. Well, let me be a little bit frank. I am not convinced about some ideas that I had this afternoon. The first one, construction of identity. The construction of identity. And someone explained that we had to abandon the subnational identity. No, that we had to reconstruct the subnational identity, and so on and so on. Well, we have to keep in mind that the world is larger than the Middle East. And what are the experiences we have in other regions regarding the construction of subnational identity? Well, that is not clear. That is not clear. Because look to the Southeast Asia at this time. What we have is a construction of identity, for instance, in multi-ethnic countries, like, for instance, Malaysia. But Malaysia is a very fragile country at this time. And they try to construct this kind of identity, subnational identity. And what we have now, even in Singapore, you speak with the people in Singapore, they will tell you, well, we constructed a multicultural identity, but that is very fragile. That is the possibility of many, can be very problematic. Well, that is something that we have to study more in depth, deeper. And second, the question of populism. Populism is not the extreme right only. Populism is extreme left. and we are speaking about violent extremism. But populism in the extreme left, they support violence against the state, against, well, I can tell you because I am a member of the political science, faculty of political science in Madrid. Most of the people that are now in the staff of the Podemos came from here. And violence is something that they keep in mind in order to change the society. And, well, of course, they are Leninists, of course. Well, that is something that we have to keep in mind because they are using also several topics, including migration, for their own purposes. That is not something innocent. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Is there another question here? Oh, the back, where? Yeah, Madame, there, the lady, and then here, first row. The lady, first row. Please make your questions shorter so that we can benefit from
Thank you. My name is Cristina Gogni. I work for Open Society, and I would like to start by thanking the previous speaker because he gave the best ground for my question. So my question is not for him, my question is for you, Rosa. Thanks for your brilliant presentation. So you have mentioned quality of democracy. I totally agree about the idea of helping citizens to become part of this political cycle and the policy-making decision process. But we are facing now in Europe, and I will start by Spain, I will continue by mentioning France and the UK, about a huge tendency, legal and political, of shrinking spaces. So it means, and it's about demonizing, prosecution, all these civil society organizations, all these social and political movements challenging the decisions of the government and that are being persecuted in the frame of citizen security laws and counterterrorism. So how is this shrinking dilemma applies to this quality of democracy and reducing of populism?
Thank you. The last question, this round. Last question here, Karim. And then...
Thank you. Karim Hauser from Casa Árabe in Madrid. One question for Rosa would be also, what do you make of the media landscape? Do you think the media has a specific role in giving voices to those who, as you say, have been obscured by the debate? And for François Burga, you mentioned it's very difficult to de-radicalize, but could we depolarize in specific places? Because I think there is a need to depolarize even before decentralizing. I think in many places, such as Libya or others, there's been so much fragmentation that the only thing that has been decentralized is the actual use of weapons. And I think there's a deep need for depolarization. I don't know if this can be done. And just an observation, I think there was on the one hand the encouragement to use a bottom-up approach, but on the other hand, the good leadership, I think, is more of a top-bottom approach. So I think the two visions are slightly clashing. Thank you.
Brief question, brief answers, if possible.
Yeah. No, I'll have to be brief because I have a taxi waiting for me. Right. EU traditionally has responded to the fact that it's not seen as particularly relevant in democratic life by trying to address the democratic deficit with the institutions, and that's where the Spitzenkandidatin process comes from. I actually think that that's not the source of the problem, and that's why it's not providing solutions. The problem is actually in national democratic life, and then it has repercussions at the European level. So that's why I think it hasn't really been successful. And I won't make any comments on the nature of the I have opinions on whether it was a good thing or not beyond this. Populism is also left-wing, yes, of course. I'm using a very standard and very accepted definition of populism, which is Kasmuda. I don't want to go into this for reasons of time, but I'd like just to say two things. And the reason I focus more on right-wing populism is that it has been far more successful in A, shaping the debate, B, being used in justifying policy choices than parties on the left, and that parties on the left have been much more easily socialized into the accepted space for political debate than parties on the right. And we have seen parties on the right join governments, coalition governments, and then go back to their anti-system positions after that, and they've done that quite successfully. So although, yes, they fit in the model of this generally accepted definition, they're not. But also, I haven't seen evidence that parties like Syriza and Podemos have violent extremism. And, you know, there are other left-wing extreme parties, but I wouldn't call them populist, right? They're not populist, are they? I mean, there are plenty of other explanations and definitions of these parties. Shrinking space, counterterrorism, yes, that's the other big issue. And here again, we have mainstream governments using counterterrorism, using security, leveraging fears in a not in a dissimilar way from the populists. Maybe they have a different rhetoric, but it's not in a dissimilar way. And that's where I think open society, but also think tanks, including myself, we actually need to think about what our responsibilities are, and it is going through policy and working out what is justifiable and what is not when encroaching on liberties. Media landscape. I happen to be, I don't know actually whether I'm in a minority, but I don't see this argument made very frequently, that actually the legal framework governing media property, the market, needs to be looked at. Because, I mean, what's happening in the UK is largely due to the property, the way in which the news market is the ownership of the news market. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that has to be looked at, but there is a massive problem in the business model of the media because of technology, and that's not being addressed. Quality media is what we need. It's what needs to be invested in. I'm not sure what the best solution is. I mean, in the old days it was state-funded, but that's no longer is no longer acceptable, nor is it. Nor should we aim for that.
Thank you, Rosa.
Thank you. I want to answer the bottom-up approach versus the top-bottom approach. Indeed, I would be cautious to recommend political decentralization in the region. I think the region is made up of a very extensive mosaic, and once we introduce this logic, it's a social fabric that would be totally destabilized in the region and maybe beyond the region too. But having said this, I do not mean by encouraging individuals to abandon their subnational identities. I do not mean that these subnational identities should be oppressed or submerged. I think the challenge is to devise a formula where representativity is provided, and at the same time unity and a central government is also preserved. Now this has different nuances, different shades and colors, which would have to be specific to each country. But if I can tell you about my own country, Lebanon, this has always been our collective thinking, cruising between two guiding lines, how to allow representativity while saving the unity of the state. And I think this has been a source of resilience for Lebanon, and in this sense it was particularly lately, after all the shocks it took refugees and others, this is a source of strength, for relative strength. Things in the region have, of course, to be relativized. So I would be very cautious to suggest or recommend decentralization. We would end up with micro states that would not have the sustainability in a region which is very, very delicate, and the social fabric is very sensitive, hence the need for a modern, accountable, but unified and central state. Thank you.
François?
Thank you. Two brief examples to illustrate the fact that I'm not against the idea of de-radicalization, but I am against the unilateralism of our definition of the target, of the scope of the target of this de-radicalization. The first example, of course, being provocative in front of a committee at the National French Assembly, I said, oh, I'm ready to participate in a session of de-radicalization at one condition. You allow me to choose who will be sitting in the room, and I want Prime Minister at that time, Manuel Valls, to be on the front row. Another expression of the same idea, I belong to a National Center for Scientific Research. Early 2015, CNRS decided that they would be part of the campaign to face terrorism. They said, we are going to fund 10 positions of researchers. And I said, great, great idea. Then I heard the name of the discipline that would be mobilized. What are we going to study? What is the target that we need to invest? Islamology. Now, where is the mistake? If I concentrate upon Islamology, it means I send a message which is very clear. I have not the slightest idea that some responsibility could be on the shoulders of a non-Muslim in my society or in the world order. So the process of de-radicalization is just like the process of reform. I love reform. But we have a tendency which is, let's reform the other. It's easier. In France, when we wake up in the morning, we're not in good mood, in underemployment. What do? A seminar on political Islam. And we dream that we are going to reform the other, and then things will improve. So my only point is to say, let's reform one another all together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This is Yes, please. Yes. Restez là-bas.
So, that is solved. Okay. François, tu ne déranges pas? Tu restes. So, thank you very much. Will not be long because we know that you have other important things to do. Some of them hang around in Barcelona, which is a nice thing to do, and others going back home. But at least a few words of conclusion and farewell till the next occasion. I'm fortunate enough to have Bishara Kader here with me, who's been the president of the General Assembly for all these last row of years, and who will continue to be with us, of course. He's not only a prominent scholar, but as seen from IEMed, a prominent member of our advisory council, and in such quality, I think he will be able to be with us at the steering committee of EuroMeSCo, helping with his experience and scientific knowledge. So we are at the end of this annual conference 2017, and I think we can be reasonably satisfied. I will pass the word just in a few minutes to Bishara Kader so that he can make some kind of conclusion and some kind of proposals as conclusions of this annual conference. I will concentrate mainly for a few minutes, short minutes in the life of the network. And I was saying that I think we can be reasonably satisfied, and that I would even say that in my view, in my sincere opinion and view, this has been going better year after year in the last few years, and we are recovering the best traditions in EuroMeSCo, which is a long tradition and very good tradition. And we are at the midpoint of this cycle of 4 years of contract with the European Commission, which, as you know, has resumed his funding and cooperation with our network. So it's a good moment to have some reflections and some thoughts about it. We are by now 106 institutes and think tanks in the network, which is a very good and high number. And we have, I would even say, in the good sense of it, pressure of people willing to join, which is a signal of good health. There are places where there is pressure to get out, and there are other places where there is pressure to get in. So we are among the places or the institutions or the clubs, if you want, where there is pressure to get in, and you know that we will try to bring in the best qualified institutions in the Euro-Mediterranean area, interested in the same issues as we are and sharing the same values as we do, which is our posted values since we started in '95 in the final declaration of the first EuroMed meetings. I think there has been, as I was saying, an increasing quality, I would even say, of the discussions, of the content of the annual conferences. And what as I see from, I remember in Pedralbes, and then in Tarragona, and in Paris, and in Milano, and in Brussels, and now in Barcelona, as I see it and I consider it carefully, I think there is a clear sign of getting it better. And I would even say at this time that we are at the midterm of this 4-year contract with the European Commission, that the methodology that we established, all of us, is working better, so that we have wonderful annual conference. I'm just transmitting the opinion that I received from most of the participants, well, from all the participants. I have had the occasion to comment on it. And the working groups are starting, or continuing in a better way, to have a sense of sharing a common job and running fine and well and getting good results, and then the dissemination of the joint policy studies gives a sense of, I don't know, seeing the results of what is being done. Then we have extremely interesting plenary sessions with high-profile speakers in the plenaries, interesting presentations in the working groups with eminent as well scholars and researchers who participate either in the explanation of the results of these working groups and the presentation of the joint policy studies or the kickoff. I've seen some of the discussions which I think will be extremely fruitful for the people who have had today the kickoff of their new projects with which they will be working all year round and have their own specific workshops in different places according to the leader of each one of the working groups. And I think there has been an effort at dissemination in which all you participated, because our website is including and will be in the new format much better to include what is being done in all the institutes. And I think that with this effort, we started already to capture in a clear way, in a specific way, not just as a general declaration, the attention of the institutions. We have said many times, all of us, that this is a network whose vocation is advocacy, not only academic study, which has to exist. You cannot do good advocacy unless you have sound, good academic work behind it. And, but certainly, I've seen, as many of you who participated, the sessions we had with the responsible people at the European Council, dealing specifically with things in Libya or Syria or elsewhere, and how much they appreciated to have the occasion to discuss with the best scholars, I was going to say in town, no, in the EuroMeSCo area on these issues. So I think that we are well equipped. We have to enhance, we know, the response, the quick response to new events. We'll try to sharpen the methodology of the policy briefs on all these instruments, organizing that kind of discussions with prominent policymakers, which doesn't always mean high ranking as well, of course. But sometimes the advisors who are in the cabinets who are preparing new policies, it's more interesting to be at the beginning, at the inception of a new policy that their boss will bring then to the banquet later on in a nice plateau. To be at the beginning of the inception of new policies and to accompany it, watching any possible deviations from the good way, as it was said before. So we are starting to do that in a good way. So we are well equipped for this role of advocacy. And this is, well, thanks to the participation from all the people in the network. And let me say that it is more specifically thanks to the efforts of some people. Well, the president up to now of our General Assembly, Bishara Kader, this is why I wish he will continue with us, and the people at the steering committee, and the people at the secretariat. And I would say Josep Ferrer, who is here, who is the organizing mind, who takes care of everything. This is why things are running fine and well. And Emmanuel Cohen, who's there and who is a bit of a mastermind of many of the things that appear in the papers and everywhere. And Alexandra Simlievska, whom you know, all of you, always working with enthusiasm. And some stagiaires that contribute in a decisive way. The first place Pierre-André, and then Doreen and Vera. And that's all that exists. So it's a small team, in fact, because they do many other things at the same time. I really appreciate what they have done and what they will continue to do, I'm sure. And it is thanks to them that this small machinery that we have keeps us being able to meet and to discuss and to have these occasions to fulfill what we have to do. But I said only that we can feel reasonably satisfied, because I feel optimistic about the network, but I cannot feel, unfortunately, that optimistic about the environment of our region. In fact, we may be even deeply worried about it. We are facing terrible problems. We never thought at the beginning, 20 years back, that we would be in that situation. I said it, well, most of us said it in these 2 days. We are not talking now about how to implement, as we did, educational programs or modernization of the public administration or the cultural development or whatever. No? We are unfortunately talking about war, about extremism, about the threat of terrorism, and so on. So EuroMeSCo is now confronted to a much more demanding task. And this is why I was saying that I am optimistic about the life of the network, but very much worried about the environment. That means that we have a lot of work to do to fulfill what we wanted always to do in this advance. There were sometime in an article I wrote a few months ago, I was talking about the EuroMed dream. Okay, well, the dream is always there, and we have to, the means through EuroMeSCo as through many other instruments. EuroMeSCo is one of the instruments, but it is getting in better shape to do it, to let us work for this. And so we are all called for a more demanding effort to help fulfill sometime this EuroMed dream. So thank you all for your presence here in Barcelona. I will pass now the word to Bishara Kader. Bishara, along with the team at the IEMed, have prepared kind of how can we summarize all this. They've been working meanwhile in the corridors, etc., in a corner, and I'm sure that Bishara will be able to summarize somehow the main thoughts that we shared. And so see you next time. I must thank you very much for the confidence you placed on me as President of the General Assembly. I will try to keep as much in touch with everybody, and especially with the team at IEMed that will continue to be the Secretariat, with the new Director of IEMed who will be in charge of it, and all the people. Josep, you will have a lot of work to be done, as usually, but I'm sure you will be happy doing it. And so, thank you very much for your attention.
Again, my dear colleagues and friends, I would like to seize this opportunity to thank again Senator Florenza for spending 11 years chairing EuroMeSCo and being the engine of growth and visibility of our network. I would like also to thank him for accepting to take up the task of the presidency, replacing me, and he will do it with efficiency, with friendship, and with dedication. We did not prepare a report, but we collected some ideas which may be considered as a summary, brief summary, which has to be re-elaborated, rewritten, reworded later on. But this has been done by Emmanuel, by Senen, by myself. So if ever you have a word or a phrase which must be elaborated or enriched, don't hesitate to send to Emmanuel a remark, even a critical remark of any point which I put here on paper. Violent extremism is a worldwide phenomenon, but it is particularly acute in the Euro-Mediterranean area. All 43 countries of the UPM are affected in a way or another. There is a perception in Europe that violent extremism is imported from abroad. This perception is only partially correct, as there is often a blowback or spillover effect related to chaos, civil wars, or foreign invasions in the Mediterranean and the MENA regions. But the majority of terrorist acts that took place in some European countries are carried out by homegrown, self-radicalized young Muslim people, or even by converts to Islam of European origin, or even by young Europeans without any connection with Islam, like the Norwegian Anders Breivik. The root causes of extremism are numerous, and the profiles of extremists are so varied. They share, however, a common denominator: humiliation, helplessness, that it is difficult, therefore, to make a general diagnosis and devise simple recipes or policies to address the issue. But creeping Islamophobia, the surge of populist and nationalist groups in Europe, the continuation or the reproduction of the authoritarianism in the Med region are significant triggers of extremism and even violent extremism. Moreover, there is a geopolitics-driven violent extremism which is linked to foreign intervention in the Med region and the MENA region, Libya, Iraq, or to continued occupation and colonization, or to proxy wars or sectarian divide, Iran, Saudi Arabia. That's why it is of paramount importance to set up a new security architecture in the EuroMed and the MENA region, as it was proposed by 2016 EuroMeSCo Annual Conference in Brussels. Solving protracted conflicts, avoiding military foreign intervention, or even ending the sectarian divide will not, by miracle, dry up the swamps of extremism. But the instrumentalizations of conflicts, foreign interventions, and sectarianism by extremists will be trimmed and diminished. Extremism may also be identity-driven. Some young Muslims born in Europe may feel alienated with a fractured identity, discriminated or marginalized, disconnected from their families or even from their communities. They may get radicalized because they are in search of a meaning for their life, a cause to defend, they resort to violence, transforming their self-hatred in hatred of the others. This identity-driven radicalization should be addressed. In the southern Mediterranean region, socioeconomic-driven radicalization seems to be predominant, as reveals a recent poll of EuroMeSCo experts. Lack of opportunities, prevailing corruption, dysfunctioning economies tend to push some young, educated people to resort to violent extremism as they harbor a deep sense of helplessness. Given the variety of root causes and profiles, only security-driven responses may be counterproductive, as they may exacerbate the phenomenon of radicalization, undermine social cohesion, or even widen the gap of misunderstanding between the two shores of the Mediterranean. Policies geared towards defeating violent extremist ideology should be proactive, long-lasting, comprehensive, not short-sighted, and not be confined to momentaneous reactive policies. Support should be provided to ethnic or religious communities achieving social inclusion and empowering them to become engaging, dialogic, and open. As radicalization is a process, not a condition, one is not born radical, he becomes radical. We must research the number of determinants of such a process, and in all cases offer a counter-narrative that is convincing and appealing, and eventually avoid pointing the responsibility to the radicals themselves, avoiding our own responsibility. The European Union on its part, should combat the widespread tendency in popular culture to portray Islam and the Muslims as anachronistic, fanatic, violent, and ignorant mass. Such imagery produces frustration, humiliation, anger, and even hatred. The studies of EuroMeSCo researchers have shown that religion is rarely the main reason for radicalization, and that there are a number of political, cultural, social, geopolitical factors that may contribute to an individual's decision to be radicalized or even violent. In fighting and defeating radicalization and violent extremism, EuroMed cooperation should be bolstered as both shores of the Mediterranean suffer from this scourge. But this cooperation should always respect human rights, freedom of expression, and of association. The role of civil societies is far from being negligible. The OPEV Observatory to Prevent Extremist Violence has set an example by organizing a conference in Barcelona on the 30th of January of this year, with the participation of 320 representatives of 172 civil society organizations, and they adopted the plan of action of the Euro-Mediterranean civil society to prevent all forms of violent extremism. This plan is inspiring, and its recommendations largely recoup our own policy proposals. There is a plethora of initiatives, programs, projects, and conferences related to radicalization and de-radicalization. They are time-wasting and resource-consuming. There should be a sort of clearinghouse mechanism or office to better coordinate these initiatives, promote synergies, or at least to make the scientific production and field research available to large audiences. The UFM, Union for the Mediterranean, has shown great interest in the issue of extremist violence or of violent extremism, mainly in the second regional forum of January 2017. EuroMeSCo is equipped, willing, and prepared to work with the Union for the Mediterranean in monitoring activities related to violent extremism and counter-violent extremism in the EuroMed region. By the same token, EuroMeSCo participants insist in being informed or even involved in any form in the EU-financed Radicalization Awareness Network. They applaud the initiative and hope that it will be reinforced and eventually upgraded. EuroMeSCo participants in the 2017 conference have shown great interest in the various de-radicalization programs and initiatives adopted and undertaken by most of the southern Mediterranean partners. A comparative study and assessment report of these initiatives are deemed necessary, and EuroMeSCo network is willing to undertake such a task. Thank you very much.
If you allow me, I would ask only for another applause for the real team who has made everything possible. Josep Ferrer, Emmanuel, Alexandra, Pierre, Doreen, and Vera. Stand up, Emmanuel. So, see you next year. See you meanwhile in all the workshops that will take place and encounters that will take place along this year cycle till we meet in the next year conference. And good luck, Bintayo. Okay, see you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
I hope it was interesting.
It was very interesting. No, this is very, very interesting. And